In the late 2000s, the most telling sound on Fifth Avenue was not traffic, but silence. An expensive, padded hush behind a door that almost never opened. Inside, a grand apartment sat arranged as if its owner might return at any hour. Rugs lay perfectly smoothed, lamps stood ready. The air itself seemed curated, cool, still, and faintly perfumed with the last careful cleaning. Nothing was decaying, nothing was lived in. The rooms held that peculiar museum-like order that signals both wealth and absence, a palace maintained for a ghost. Across town, in a New York hospital, the woman who owned that quiet splendor lay in a bed that had, by then, become less a temporary stop than an address. She was an elderly heiress, famously private, with a fortune that had once seemed as solid as the limestone facades on the avenue. Her world had narrowed to fluorescent light, the rhythmic sigh of machines, and the soft choreography of people who entered with clipboards and pleasant voices. Lawyers came, accountants came. A widening circle of helpers appeared, some devoted, some ambitious, all necessary in one way or another. The scene did not feel like scandal. It felt like an administration. This story does not begin as a whodunit. There is no single night, no missing jewel, no dramatic confession. The mystery is quieter and perhaps more modern. Stewardship. How does one of America's richest women end up living for years in a hospital room, effectively sequestered, while her home's plural sit immaculate and nearly untouched? How does enormous liquidity coexist with daily dependence? And why do great houses, built to stage a life, continue to insist on being cared for after the life inside them has gone still? The heiress was Huguette Clark, daughter of William A. Clark, the copper magnate and senator who in the Gilded Age imagination sits somewhere between tycoon and myth. His money had the weight of ore, extracted, refined, stacked into monuments. Huguette, born into that mass of capital, grew into something different, an adult who avoided publicity so completely that even her absence became a presence. For decades she lived quietly, collected art and dolls, and occupied her spaces lightly, like a person trying not to leave fingerprints on her own life. But by the late 2000s, the paradox hardened into a tableau. Fifth Avenue, one of the most expensive streets on earth, held an apartment preserved at great cost and seldom used. Elsewhere, there were other properties, houses with names and histories, maintained with a devotion that bordered on reverence. Staff were paid, repairs were made, taxes were settled, insurance renewals were signed. The machinery of ownership never stopped, even as the owner no longer walked through her own front door. At the hospital, the machinery was different but equally relentless. Aging, in its most practical sense, is a transfer of power, from the body to the schedule, from independence to the people who manage medications, meals, calls, visitors. In wealthy families, that transfer is cushioned by money, private rooms, attentive care, the ability to hire expertise. Yet, the cushion can also become a barrier, softening the world until only selected voices reach the bed. Huguette's hospital life was, on paper, extraordinary. Not merely a stay, but a long residency, months turning into years. There were explanations offered in the language of caution, medical complexity, frailty, the need for supervision. There were also explanations that sounded more like habit. It was easier, it was safer, it was what she preferred. And in the gaps between those explanations grew the unsettling thought that preference can be shaped, especially when a person is isolated and the only company comes in professional roles. The people around her did not wear the costumes of villains. They wore suits, scrubs, and the polite expressions of those accustomed to being trusted. They spoke in the careful cadence of fiduciary duty. In an era when old money is imagined as effortless silver trays, quiet philanthropy, houses that run themselves here, was the opposite. Wealth that required constant management, and the human life increasingly mediated by gatekeepers. Meanwhile, the apartment stayed ready. Imagine the logistics behind such readiness. Even unoccupied, a Fifth Avenue residence demands routine, climate control to protect wood and art, periodic inspections to prevent leaks, cleaning to keep dust from settling into fabric and time into corners. Someone changes light bulbs in rooms that no one enters. Someone polishes fixtures for hands that do not touch them. Security systems are tested. Doormen nod at deliveries that never arrive. In the ledgers of building management, the apartment is a line item. In the psychology of the avenue, it is a mystery, an illuminated window that remains dark. The contrast is not merely architectural, it is existential. A person can own a fortune and still require permission to make a phone call. She can control acres of property and yet depend on a nurse to adjust a pillow. The public fantasy of inherited wealth promises insulation from indignity, but age has a way of ignoring bank balances. Money can buy time, comfort, and expertise. It cannot buy youth. It cannot guarantee honest counsel. It cannot always keep loneliness from taking the shape of routine. In old photographs, the world Huguette inherited was a world of grand thresholds, marble lobbies, carved doors, servants' corridors hidden behind paneling. Those houses were built around the idea of separation, front stage splendor, backstage labor. In her hospital room, that separation persisted in miniature. The public saw almost nothing. The decisions were made off stage. And yet, the consequences of those decisions were immense. Money moved, caretakers gained influence, and properties remained in suspended animation, as if the owner's will could hold back the practical truth that an empty house is, eventually, a different kind of ruin. Outside the hospital, life in New York went on. Taxes honked. Seasons turned. Fifth Avenue reinvented itself again and again. Inside, the days were measured by vitals and visitors, by signatures and charts. A woman who had avoided society now lived within an institution, surrounded by professionals whose livelihoods depended, in some way, on her continued existence and her continued trust. Was that protection? Was it exploitation? Could it be both at once, care braided with control, devotion mixed with opportunity? And then there is the second riddle, quieter but no less haunting. What happens to great houses when their owner stops living in them but never lets them go? When the lights are maintained, the floors waxed, the gardens trimmed, not for a party next week, but for a return that may never come? In the stillness of those preserved rooms and the antiseptic glow of that hospital, the same question lingered, unanswered, waiting for the paperwork to catch up with the human heart. Long before the Fifth Avenue apartment became a silent shrine, the Clark fortune was loud in the way the late 19th century preferred its success, proclaimed, landscaped, carved into stone, and placed where other powerful men could not ignore it. To understand why Huguette could later cling to empty rooms with such tenacity, the story has to step back to the man who first treated real estate not as shelter, but as a statement. William Andrews Clark did not merely acquire money, he built an argument with it. Clark's trajectory fit the national mythology, east to west, modest beginnings to hard-won prosperity, the frontier as both testing ground and invitation. He arrived in the American West when it was still fluid enough for an ambitious newcomer to remake himself, and he moved through a succession of roles, teacher, merchant, banker, operated before the great engine of his wealth came fully into view. Copper, more than any other metal, belonged to the modern age. It carried electricity, it wired cities, it threaded itself into telegraph lines and industrial machinery. To have copper was to have a stake in the future, and Clark understood that a stake in the future could be converted into power in the present. But copper money, especially on the scale Clark pursued, was never gentle. It was extracted from the earth and from human labor, translated into shares and bonds, fought over in boardrooms and courtrooms, and then crucially spent in ways that made the struggle seem inevitable, even noble. The Gilded Age had a particular faith that fortunes should be legible. A man could be rich in private, but truly important men were rich in public. They placed their wealth on prominent streets, filled their walls with European paintings, hosted dinners that required orchestration, and joined institutions that turned private capital into social authority. Clark wanted that authority. He wanted legitimacy, and he wanted it where legitimacy was minted, in the great cities of the East, within the social circles that had once regarded Western millionaires as temporary weather. Politics, philanthropy, and architecture all offered routes into that world, and Clark pursued each with a determined, sometimes abrasive confidence. His story, told sympathetically, is one of extraordinary drive, an immigrant's son or a man of modest origins forcing open doors that had been designed to stay closed. Told more critically, it is a story of ego and appetite, a man who could not bear to be merely wealthy when he could be unmistakable. In that era, the most unmistakable thing a man could do was build. Not just a comfortable house, but a residence that behaved like a monument. A great home on an elite avenue was a kind of passport. It placed one's name into the daily vocabulary of the city, the doorman's nod, the carriage turning at the curb, the society pages noting an arrival. Architecture did what money alone could not always accomplish. It suggested permanence. It implied taste. It performed stability. For men like Clark, whose wealth had come quickly and from industries that felt raw and aggressive, permanence had to be manufactured. Yet even as Clark chased the visible rewards of grandeur, the hidden costs began to accumulate. A trophy residence is not a passive asset, it is a living apparatus. The facade, once raised, demands continual maintenance if it is to remain credible. A mansion's roof does not care about pedigree. A boiler does not respect a family name. Paint peels, pipes sweat, plaster cracks with the settling of seasons. The larger the house, the more it behaves like a small enterprise requiring staff, schedules, contracts, and constant attention to details that the guests never notice. In the Gilded Age, that enterprise was staffed by human beings whose labor had to be both omnipresent and invisible. A large household meant cooks, maids, laundresses, footmen, and butlers, each with specific duties and hierarchies, each requiring wages, meals, uniforms, and oversight. There were chauffeurs as automobiles arrived, gardeners to keep grounds immaculate, and watchmen to ensure that the owner's absence did not become an invitation. Even an unoccupied house carried payroll. Even a closed season required caretakers to prevent the building from slipping into decay. And then there was the social performance, the most expensive maintenance of all. Houses of this scale were not simply places to live, they were stages on which a family demonstrated that it belonged. That demonstration cost money in ways that never appeared on the front page. Entertaining required flowers by the cartload, silver polished until it reflected candlelight like water, imported foods, wines, and the endless laundering of linens. It required invitations, tact, and sometimes the careful purchase of art and furnishings that announced refinement. The guests might see a glittering dining room and assume ease. The staff saw production, repeated night after night with no allowance for error. Clark, for all his ambition, could not have been ignorant of these demands. In fact, he likely embraced them as part of the price of entry. If wealth was a machine, then visibility was the fuel that kept it respected. But machines have their own logic. Once built, they do not like to be turned off. A mansion cannot easily be downsized without admitting defeat. A great collection cannot be dispersed without signaling that a fortune is thinning. Even the act of closing a house for too long invites whispers. Where are they? Are they well? Can they still afford it? This is the burden embedded in the triumph. Clark's money was self-made in the sense that he fought for it and multiplied it. But it was never solely his to enjoy. It became an institution, assets, obligations, reputations, employees, and properties requiring constant feeding. Taxes had to be paid. Repairs had to be commissioned. Managers had to be trusted. Lawyers had to translate ambition into legal reality. And as the estate grew, so did the distance between the owner and the practical work of keeping it all alive. In time, that distance would shape the life of his younger daughter in ways Clark could not have predicted. Huguette would inherit not only wealth, but the architecture of her father's ego. Houses built to prove something, properties maintained to sustain a narrative, and an expectation, spoken or unspoken, that what had been made visible must never be allowed to look abandoned. The Clark fortune, from the beginning, carried a paradox. It promised independence, yet it created dependence on staff, on systems, on the ceaseless vigilance required to keep grandeur from slipping into mere emptiness. And so, before Huguette ever entered the frame as a shy child surrounded by privilege, the house problem was already there, quietly waiting in the foundations. The question was never only how to build a palace. It was how to live with one, year after year, when the applause faded and the bills kept coming, an inheritance of stone and obligation that would, eventually, press down on a far more private soul. For a brief, astonishing span of years, Fifth Avenue held a kind of private mountain, an edifice so intent on grandeur that it seemed to bend the street around it. At 960 Fifth Avenue facing Central Park, William A. Clark raised a mansion that was less a home than a declaration, a stone-bound sentence in the language the Gilded Age understood best. I have arrived, and I intend to remain. New York at the turn of the century was a city where architecture argued for status. A man could not merely be wealthy. He had to be seen to be wealthy in the right place, in the right style, with the right materials. The avenue was a gallery of competing claims, Vanderbilts, Astors, Fricks, each facade a résumé in limestone and iron. Clark, with the blunt confidence of Western money, chose not to whisper. He built high and heavy in pale stone that caught the shifting gray of Manhattan light, and he filled it with a kind of European-inspired splendor that signaled cultural seriousness as much as spending power. From the sidewalk, the mansion's scale was its first argument. It rose above its neighbors with a mass that felt almost civic, its windows set in disciplined rows, its entrance framed to receive carriages with the ease of a theater taking patrons. Inside, the architecture performed its second argument, that the owner possessed not only money, but taste. Visitors moved through a sequence of rooms designed to impress and stages an arrival hall that recalibrated expectations, formal reception spaces that encouraged admiration, galleries and drawing rooms that suggested a cultivated life. The materials mattered because they were legible. Marble underfoot was not simply durable, it was a signal that the house was meant to last. Carved woodwork oak, mahogany, perhaps walnut was not merely decoration. It was time, labor, and craft preserved in paneling. Ceilings carried plasterwork and painted ornament. Staircases were built not only for movement, but for procession, allowing an entrance to be observed. In a world before television, the house itself was the screen on which a family projected its identity. Clark's art program, too, was part of the architecture. Paintings, sculpture, tapestries, and objects from Europe were arranged to create an atmosphere of old-world continuity. An attempt, in a young country, to borrow the aura of centuries. The collection did not exist in isolation. It was placed within sightlines and rooms meant to frame it. Guests did not simply see art. They were guided, subtly, to see the owner as the kind of man who belonged among it. But opulence at this level was never only the glittering surface. The mansion functioned because an unseen infrastructure held it up. Behind the formal rooms were service corridors and back staircases, routes designed to keep labor out of sight. A great Fifth Avenue house was a machine with two circulatory systems, the public one for guests and the private one for staff. The butler's pantry, the kitchens, the linen rooms, the coal storage, the servants' hall, these were not afterthoughts. They were essential organs. Consider the daily logistics. Deliveries arrived early, crates of produce, cuts of meat, sacks of flour and sugar, blocks of ice in warmer months, coal or coke for heat in winter. Horses and wagons brought goods to side entrances where they could be received without disrupting the front door's dignity. Inside, the kitchen staff transformed those deliveries into meals that appeared as if by magic courses timed, sauces warm, plates heated, coffee ready at precisely the right moment. Upstairs, maids aired rooms, beat dust from fabrics, made beds that would not be slept in, and polished surfaces until they gleamed under gaslight or, later, electric fixtures. Heating alone required constant attention. A house of that size could not be kept comfortable by a single fireplace. Boilers, radiators, and ducted systems, whatever technology was installed, needed fuel, monitoring, and repair. In winter, the cost was not only monetary, it was labor, the endless movement of men in basement spaces, shoveling, stoking, checking gauges, keeping the temperature steady so that guests would never think of the machinery below their feet. Lighting, too, had its backstage life. Gas fixtures demanded maintenance and caution. Early electricity required wiring, generators, and the careful replacement of bulbs and fuses. The brilliance in the drawing room depended on someone working in a utility space no visitor would ever see. Even entertaining, a central purpose of the mansion, was an exercise in choreography. A dinner for prominent guests required menus planned days in advance, table settings counted, wine decanted, flowers arranged, silver and crystal polished until they seemed almost too perfect to touch. Footmen moved with rehearsed precision, trained to appear attentive without being intrusive. The household's success depended on a strange discipline, to labor constantly while pretending not to exist. Glamour, in this sense, was a product manufactured, maintained, and quietly paid for. And paid for it was. Beyond construction costs, there were wages, food for staff, uniforms, repairs, insurance, and the relentless drip of minor expenditures that keep a palace from slipping into shabby theater. A mansion was a symbol of permanence, yet its permanence was fragile. It could be threatened by a leaking roof, a financial downturn, a family dispute, or the slow shift of fashion that made yesterday's grandeur seem merely cumbersome. That vulnerability would become, in retrospect, one of the most poignant ironies of the Clark mansion. Built as a legacy in stone, it existed within a city that never truly stops negotiating its own value. Land under a mansion could become more profitable than the mansion itself. Neighborhoods changed, tastes changed, and the very idea of living in a single-family palace on Fifth Avenue began to feel less like destiny and more like an eccentricity. For Huguette Clark, the mansion was the atmosphere of childhood rooms meant for crowds, hallways meant for spectacle, spaces built to hold the weight of her father's ambition. Yet the child who grew up surrounded by that architecture would become, by temperament, its opposite. She was born into a stage set for social performance, but she would be drawn to quieter corners, to controlled worlds of her own making, to solitude that required no audience. In that contrast between a house designed to be seen and a life that preferred not to be one can already glimpse the future. The mansion at 960 Fifth Avenue was created to outlast a lifetime, to make a name durable. And still, like so many Gilded Age monuments, it would prove more vulnerable than it looked, subject to the city's appetite and the family's changing needs. In the next turn of the story, the question becomes not how such houses were built, but how they were kept, reshaped, and sometimes let go, whether by choice, necessity, or the quiet drift of time that makes even palaces temporary. In a house built to be noticed, the smallest figure was often the easiest to miss. Huguette Clark entered the world not as a social comet, but as a late, delicate addition to an already established dynasty born when her father was no longer a young conqueror but an aging patriarch, more conscious of legacy than beginnings. Around her rose the marble and carved wood of Fifth Avenue, the polished rituals of servants' footsteps, and the soft, regulated air of rooms where everything had a proper place, including the child. The Clarks lived within layers, public rooms arranged for display, private suites guarded by etiquette, and service corridors where the household's true motion flowed. Access was a form of currency, and in such homes it was carefully controlled. Visitors arrived through front doors and formal halls. Children, especially girls, were often guided along quieter routes, watched over by governesses or nurses. Their friendships filtered, their days structured with the belief that safety and refinement were the same thing. For Huguette, privacy was not merely a preference that developed later. It was part of the air she breathed, a kind of personal architecture erected around her from the start. She was the younger daughter, and in a family shaped by a powerful father, that position carried its own peculiar freedom and constraint. She would not be forced into the public role expected of an heir. She would also not be encouraged to test herself against the world. In the Gilded Age imagination, great houses were schools in themselves, teaching children how to move, how to speak, how to perform good breeding. Yet they also taught another lesson, that life could be managed at a distance. Needs could be met without asking. Problems could be handled out of sight. A young person could grow up insulated from rough edges so completely that even ordinary contact began to feel like a kind of risk. In Huguette's case, the interior world offered richer rewards than the street outside. Art was not an extracurricular. It was an environment. Paintings hung on walls as naturally as windows opened onto the park. Decorative objects sat under glass, meant to be admired and protected. Music drifted through rooms in which acoustics had been considered as carefully as furniture. If she studied the piano, it was not to impress a classroom, but to fill a drawing room with controlled beauty, notes that began and ended exactly as she wished. Painting, too, offered a private realm. A canvas asked for attention, patience, and solitude, qualities that could thrive in a household where silence was both possible and respected. The act of mixing color and shaping light allowed a child to govern a small universe in a life surrounded by servants who anticipated needs. Art provided something more personal, decisions that belonged entirely to the maker. A brushstroke did not require permission. Then there were dolls and miniatures, objects that, to an outside eye, might seem like simple playthings but in truth echoed the logic of the mansion itself. Miniature rooms, tiny furnishings, carefully dressed figures, these were worlds that could be arranged, preserved, and restored. They did not argue. They did not demand introductions. They offered the satisfactions of order and control in a form that fit on a tabletop. In a great house where so much was designed for other people's eyes, a miniature could be a refuge, an intimate stage set where the director never had to open the door to guests. Huguette's education, like her upbringing, unfolded with the careful selectivity of her class. Instruction could be brought in rather than sought out. Tutors, music teachers, and art instructors came to her, reducing the need for the messy democracy of public schooling. Such an arrangement offered excellence on demand, and it did reduce certain risks. It also narrowed the field of experience. A child who rarely needed to navigate unfamiliar settings could grow into an adult for whom unfamiliarity itself felt unbearable. The staff around her, maids, companions, governesses, provided constancy, but it was a constancy shaped by roles. Servants could be kind, even loving, yet the relationship was defined by service and distance, by the fact that one person was paid to remain. The emotional life of a child in such a setting could become both rich and curiously constrained, surrounded by people, yet missing the unscripted intimacy of equals. Abundance here did not automatically produce breadth. It could produce repetition. It could produce a life in which everything was provided, and therefore little was pursued. Her father's presence, too, cast a long shadow. William A. Clark was a man who had fought to make himself permanent, and children in such households often learned early that family life could orbit around a single gravitational force. An aging patriarch might be indulgent. He might also be controlling in ways so normalized that they were almost invisible. In that atmosphere, quiet could become not only a temperament but a strategy. Speaking less meant making fewer demands. Wanting less meant being safer. Privacy became a form of self-possession. This is the emotional logic that matters later, when questions of property and isolation begin to look less like eccentric choices and more like a coherent pattern. For Huguette, homes were never merely backdrops for social triumph. They were containers, places that held memory, objects, and the feeling of being shielded from intrusion. To step outside that shield was to accept unpredictability, and unpredictability is what her world had always trained her to avoid. The contrast is stark, and it is the kind that can be misunderstood. From the outside, her resources were limitless, any lesson, any comfort, any object that could be bought. From the inside, the experience could be narrow, the same rooms, the same careful routines, the same controlled encounters. Abundance reduced the need to engage, and over time, reduced the habit of engagement itself, until quiet stopped being a phase and became a lifelong home. As the great Fifth Avenue mansion and its rituals shaped her early years, Huguette learned an art that would define her far more than society ever did, the art of disappearing in plain sight. And as the family's houses multiplied and shifted with the seasons, the question of where she truly lived among people or among possessions began to settle into the story like a private, enduring theme. California has always sold two visions at once: the public coastline, sunlit and shared, and the private coastline, gated and held in trust by money. Bellosguardo belonged to the second California, a rare stretch of Santa Barbara oceanfront where the Pacific did not feel like scenery but like possession, an ever-moving blue wall beyond lawns and palms, close enough to salt the air and whiten the edges of ironwork. The estate's siding was its first masterpiece. Bellosguardo was placed to command a viewshed, that priceless corridor of sight where land and sea meet without interruption. From the house, the horizon did not merely appear, it arrived like a daily performance, with morning haze lifting into bright, hard color and evenings dissolving into apricot light. Even the soundscape was curated by geography, waves breaking below, wind moving through eucalyptus, the muffled distance of town kept at bay by acreage and hedges. It was easy, standing there, to understand why an heiress who had learned to love controlled worlds would be drawn to a property that felt like an entire kingdom with its own weather. Santa Barbara in the interwar years had cultivated an image of Mediterranean ease: white stucco, red tile roofs, wrought iron balconies, and courtyards that suggested Spain or Italy without the inconvenience of history. The region's elite embraced that romance with enthusiasm, especially after the 1925 earthquake pushed the city toward cohesive architectural standards. Bellosguardo, with its revival aura and oceanfront privilege, fit perfectly into that fantasy. It was not a Manhattan monument meant to intimidate rivals. It was a coastal retreat meant to soothe, a place where money could appear relaxed. Approach mattered. A property like Bellosguardo was designed to change a person's tempo. One did not simply arrive, one entered. Gates and drives created distance from the street, a psychological shedding of the outside world. Landscaping did the rest. Lawns open like carpets. Plantings framed the ocean the way a gilded frame holds a painting. Palms and cypresses stood as vertical punctuation, while hedges controlled sightlines, ensuring that even on open land, privacy could be maintained. The garden was not merely decorative, it was a tool, shaping what could be seen and who could come close. The estate's beauty, however, was never accidental. Coastal gardens demand constant negotiation with the elements. Salt air corrodes metal and dulls paint. Wind prunes aggressively. Sun bleaches fabrics and stresses wood. Even the most natural-looking landscape is, in practice, a managed system of irrigation lines, pruning schedules, fertilizing routines, pest control, and replacement plantings. The romantic California garden, lush, effortless, always in bloom, is among the most labor-intensive illusions wealth can purchase. Bellosguardo had its own infrastructure for movement, a reminder that estates are logistical as much as aesthetic. In the early years, the rhythms of carriage and then automobile shaped the property's design. Turnarounds, garages, service drives, discrete routes for deliveries. Staff needed to move food, linens, fuel, and supplies without crossing the same thresholds as guests. The house might present one face to visitors' terraces, ocean breezes, rooms opening onto gardens, but it also had another face entirely, one oriented toward work. Somewhere behind the scenes were storage spaces, laundry operations, maintenance rooms, and the endless hidden closets and corridors that allow a grand house to seem serene. And then there was the structure itself, that seemingly timeless combination of stucco and tile that reads as permanent in postcards. In reality, coastal stucco is a living skin. It cracks, it absorbs moisture, it must be patched and painted, especially where storms drive rain sideways and wind pushes water into places it does not belong. Roof tiles shift and break, flashing fails, gutters clog with debris carried on ocean gusts, salt encourages rust where metal is exposed. A paradise property sits under a paradise sky, but it is also on the front line of weather. This is where the second California, the one no brochure celebrates, asserts itself. For every sunlit view there is an invoice. For every terrace there is a crew. Paradise requires payroll. Caretakers become the true residents of such places. Even when the owner is absent, someone must be present to listen for the small warnings, the unusual drip, the hairline crack, the smell of damp after a storm. Security must be maintained not only to keep out intruders, but to keep the property from becoming a magnet for curiosity. Locks are checked, alarms tested, gates repaired, insurance requirements met. An estate left alone is an estate at risk, and risk, for old money, is never merely personal, it is reputational. Water, too, tells the story of hidden labor. Gardens on that scale rely on irrigation systems that are both sophisticated and fragile, valves that stick, lines that leak underground, timers that fail at the worst moments. A single brick can waste thousands of gallons and ruin plantings that took years to shape. In dry seasons, the calculus grows sharper. Maintaining green lawns and flourishing borders is not just a matter of taste, it is a matter of constant management, a form of stewardship that can feel like devotion or like burden depending on who is paying and who is watching. For Huguette Clark, Bellosguardo would become something more than a beautiful property. It became a character in her life, a physical embodiment of her longing for privacy without austerity. New York offered control through walls and discretion. Bellosguardo offered control through distance and acreage. It suggested a life in which one could breed, paint, listen to music, and exist quietly while the ocean did the talking. Yet the very features that made it a sanctuary also made it heavy. A city apartment can be locked and left, its systems largely maintained by a building. A coastal estate cannot be paused so easily. Its grounds keep growing, its surfaces keep aging. Its exposure to storms and salt does not respect an owner's moods. Retreat, in other words, is not the same as escape, it simply moves the work to a different stage. As years passed and Huguette's public life narrowed, Bellosguardo's caretaking needs did not narrow with it. If anything, they became more intense because an unoccupied house requires a special kind of vigilance. When people live in a home, problems announce themselves quickly. When a house sits quiet, small failures can grow in silence. A leak can run unnoticed. A pest infestation can expand. Mold can take hold where ocean moisture lingers. The staff becomes the property's nervous system, sensing trouble and responding before it becomes visible. There is, too, the emotional maintenance, harder to quantify, but just as real. When an owner retreats, the estate can begin to feel like a promise being held open, kept immaculate for a return, preserved as if time itself could be managed. Rooms are aired, windows are cleaned, furniture is protected. The garden is kept just so, not for guests next weekend, but for an idea of the owner that still belongs to the place. In that devotion there is tenderness. There is also a kind of melancholy, because the work is ongoing whether or not anyone is there to enjoy the view. Bellosguardo thus captures the central contrast of Huguette Clark's story. On the surface, it is paradise oceanfront lawns, Mediterranean serenity, a private world where wealth appears to float above ordinary concerns. Beneath the surface, it is an enterprise, Payroll, repairs, security, irrigation, storm preparedness, and the ceaseless correction of nature's insistence that nothing stays perfect for long. In the romantic imagination, an heiress retreats to the coast and finds peace. In reality, peace at Bellosguardo required an entire workforce, moving quietly through the property like stagehands in a theater, keeping the illusion intact. And as Huguette's attachment to her houses deepened, the question began to sharpen. Was Bellosguardo a refuge she owned, or a responsibility that owned her one more magnificent room in which quiet could echo until it became, at last, a kind of captivity? Fortunes do not pass like heirlooms handed across a parlor. They pass like weather systems slow to form, sudden in impact, and followed by a long season of cleanup. For Huguette Clark, the pivotal losses in her family did not simply bring grief and privacy. They brought an administrative afterlife, a machine of inheritance that began turning the moment death certificates were signed. The first great transition was the loss of William A. Clark, the titan whose money had built rooms large enough to swallow a childhood whole. His death did what even his will could not prevent. It loosened the household's central gravity. Yet his wealth did not dissolve into simplicity. It divided into trusts, accounts, properties, and collections assets meant to protect the daughters and preserve discretion, but also designed to endure, which is another way of saying designed to be managed forever. In the years that followed, more doors closed. Huguette's mother died. Her sister Andre was gone as well. With each death, the circle tightened until the fortune's ownership became less shared and more concentrated. And Huguette, already inclined toward quiet, found herself holding the keys to an empire of maintenance. The public might imagine inheritance as a liberation, the freedom to do as one pleases, to live without worry. But the private reality of inherited wealth, especially old wealth with old properties, is that it arrives with obligations attached like tags on new clothes, except these tags cannot be removed. By then, the Clarks' assets were not merely numbers on a page. They were places that required constant attention and objects that could not be treated as ordinary possessions. Property taxes alone created a steady pressure. A Fifth Avenue apartment, a Santa Barbara estate, other residences and parcels each came with assessments that rose and fell with markets and municipal needs, and each required timely payment regardless of whether anyone slept there. Taxes do not care if a house is loved, abandoned, or sealed like a time capsule. They arrive on schedule. Insurance was its own universe of paperwork and risk calculation. A grand house, particularly one with valuable art and historic features, is not insured like a suburban home. Policies are layered. Coverage for the structure, coverage for contents, special riders for collections, liability coverage for staff and visitors, and requirements that demand proof of upkeep. Insurers want alarms tested, water shutoff systems functional, electrical panels updated, and sometimes round-the-clock security if a property sits empty. In other words, the privilege of protection comes with a checklist. Then there is staffing, the least visible but most continuous expense. A property that is lived in can rely on routine. A property that is seldom used needs a different kind of routine, one built around prevention. Some estates maintain live-in caretakers, couples who occupy discreet quarters and provide constant presence. Others shift to contracted labor, gardeners on schedule, housekeepers and rotating teams, maintenance specialists called in as needed. Each model has trade-offs. Live-in staff provide immediate response and a human deterrent to trespass, but they require housing, boundaries, and long-term trust. Contracted teams can be efficient and professional, but the property becomes a job site rather than a home, and oversight becomes essential to prevent neglect or overreach. Collections management complicates everything further. Paintings, antique furniture, rare books, porcelain, dolls, miniatures, objects that feel intimate can be worth fortunes, and their care is a science. Temperature and humidity must be controlled. Light exposure must be limited. Fabrics need protection from moths and fading. Wood responds to moisture by swelling and shrinking, opening joints and lifting veneers. Paper becomes brittle. Even dolls with their delicate materials can crack or discolor if stored improperly. Conservation is not a one-time act, it is ongoing triage against time. The houses themselves require the same kind of vigilance. Even when unoccupied, they must be heated enough to prevent freezing and plumbing damage, cooled enough to prevent mold, and ventilated enough to keep air from turning stale and damp. Roofs must be inspected, gutters cleared, stucco patched, paint renewed, termites watched for in California, water intrusion watched for everywhere. Mechanical systems, boilers, pumps, security lines need periodic running because machines fail faster when they sit unused. Standing still for a building is not neutral. It is a slow form of decline. And through all of it runs paperwork, the shadow companion of a quiet life. Bills arrive, contractors submit estimates, lawyers review agreements, accountants reconcile accounts, trustees and advisors convene to confirm compliance, to document decisions, to protect against future disputes. In a fortune of this magnitude, even a minor choice, changing a policy, moving a painting, hiring a new caretaker, creates a trail. Discretion, so prized by families like the Clarks, does not reduce paperwork. It increases it, because secrecy demands control, and control demands documentation. This is the inheritance machine, a system designed to preserve wealth and privacy, but also one that expands the perimeter of risk. Every property is a potential lawsuit if someone is injured. Every valuable object is a temptation for theft. Every vacant room is an opportunity for a leak to become a catastrophe. The larger the estate, the more it resembles an enterprise with liabilities that must be managed as carefully as assets. For someone like Huguette, who seemed to find comfort in continuity, the most natural instinct was to avoid disruption. Do not sell. Do not change. Do not invite attention. Yet not changing anything can become the most expensive choice of all. A house kept in stasis still ages, and the cost of preventing visible decay often exceeds the cost of adapting a property to modern use. When a residence becomes a preserved set, maintenance shifts from practical repairs to conservation-level care, a kind of permanent holding pattern that consumes money quietly, year after year. Inherited fortune, then, revealed its double nature. It could buy solitude, but it could not make solitude simple. It could shield an owner from ordinary anxieties, yet it created extraordinary responsibilities, deadlines, audits, renewals, inspections, payroll. Freedom, in this context, was conditional, granted so long as the machine kept running, so long as someone, usually many someones, kept feeding it. By the time Huguette stood as the last major custodian of the Clark wealth, her life was surrounded by an apparatus built to protect her. The question was whether protection and control could be separated. The invoices and schedules did not merely serve her wishes. They shaped what was possible. And as the years advanced and the owner's world narrowed, the machine did what machines do. It demanded managers. It demanded intermediaries. And it created a situation in which the boundary between caretaking and command could become dangerously thin, setting the stage for the modern, unsettling chapter that would follow. The larger Huguette Clark's outer world became houses on coasts, apartments on the most coveted avenue in America. The more her attention drifted toward things that could fit in the hands. In a life ringed by acreage and marble, she chose the intimacy of paper, paint, and small faces with porcelain skin. It was not a retreat into childishness so much as a decision about scale. The public world was vast, unpredictable, and hungry for stories. The private world could be arranged, understood, and kept. Her own artwork belonged to that private realm. Painting offered an exchange with silence, a discipline of observation and patience. It asked for light, color, and time, and it rewarded effort with something tangible that did not require an audience. A canvas did not interrupt, did not gossip, did not demand introductions. In the careful shaping of a scene or a figure, Huguette could be present without being exposed. Art allowed her to leave evidence of herself while still remaining, in the social sense, unseen. Alongside painting came dolls and miniatures, a collecting passion that, in the wrong hands, can be treated as mere oddity. For Huguette, it functioned more like a language. Dolls are portraits of an era's ideals. Fashion, innocence, craftsmanship made durable in bisque, cloth, wood, and hair. Miniatures are architecture reduced to a manageable universe, a house that can be mastered completely. A doll's trunk, a tiny tea service, a perfectly scaled chair. These objects do not simply represent childhood. They represent control, order, and the comfort of a world where everything has a place and nothing happens without permission. Such collections also invite a kind of tenderness that grand properties rarely do. It is easy to be overwhelmed by the impersonal mass of a mansion. It is easier to love, intimately, a single object cared for over decades. The act of collecting can become a steadying ritual, researching, acquiring, cataloging, arranging, each step reinforcing identity when other identities feel imposed. Huguette did not seem to need applause. She needed continuity. Letters became another form of continuity. In correspondence, she could choose her distance. A letter is both connection and boundary, words offered without the unpredictability of a visit, intimacy controlled by the page. For a woman who preferred discretion, the mailbox could be a safer salon than any drawing room. Through letters, she could sustain relationships with dealers, advisors, artists, and a small circle of trusted individuals, maintaining contact while avoiding the exhausting theater of public society. She also practiced patronage in ways that matched her temperament. Rather than grand public gestures, her support could be targeted and personal, helping institutions, acquiring works, funding care for objects she valued. Patronage, at its best, is an extension of attention, money deployed not to be seen, but to preserve what might otherwise vanish. For someone raised amid art meant to legitimize a fortune, this quieter form of engagement was a kind of reversal. She was not building a public image, she was building a private refuge. Yet even a refuge made of small things requires an unexpectedly large apparatus. Miniatures sit innocently on shelves, but behind them is the machinery of the art world. Dealers who locate rare pieces, appraisers who assign value, conservators who assign value, conservators who repair delicate surfaces, and insurers who calculate risk. Authenticity matters, and authenticity is never assumed. Provenance must be traced. Marks and materials examined. Condition documented. In a market where a single object can be worth more than a year of wages for a household staff, every purchase carries stakes. Acquisition creates another chain of logistics. Shipping fragile antiques is a specialized craft. Custom crates, climate considerations, courier services, and careful routes that minimize vibration and temperature swings. Storage requires space that is secure and stable, protected from fire, water, pests, and casual handling. Cataloging becomes essential not only for personal order, but for legal clarity, an inventory that can withstand scrutiny from insurers, auditors, and, eventually, an estate court. Gatekeeping grows naturally around such a life. Assistants screen calls and manage appointments. Bankers and accountants monitor transactions. Lawyers review contracts and gifts. Security measures expand quietly. Safes, alarm systems, discrete protocols for who may enter which room, who may handle which object. The collection's innocence is protected by high-stakes infrastructure, and that infrastructure, in turn, creates a new form of dependence. The more valuable and rare the small world becomes, the more people are required to keep it safe. There is a poignant contrast here. A doll's face suggests simplicity, a return to a gentler age. But around that face swirl modern realities, valuations, tax implications, authenticity disputes, and the constant awareness that wealth attracts attention. What looks like play is, in practice, stewardship. What looks like private pleasure is surrounded by professional management. And still, for Huguette, the miniature world offered something the grand world often could not, a sense that life could be held without being performed. In a mansion, rooms exist to be filled. In a dollhouse, rooms can remain perfect forever. In a public life, silence invites interpretation. In a private collection, silence is simply peace. As the years move forward, this carefully curated inner life would become both shield and vulnerability. The smaller her chosen world, the more crucial the gatekeepers became, and the more consequential it would be, later, to ask who controlled the gates, who benefited from the quiet, and what it cost to keep a life and its treasures permanently in miniature. An empty house is never truly empty. It breathes, it shifts, it collects moisture and dust, it listens to the weather, and it quietly begins to forget what it was built for. In Huguette Clark's story, the long withdrawal was not a dramatic departure with trunks and farewells. It was a gradual thinning of presence, fewer nights spent under her own roof, longer intervals between visits until, almost without announcement, her great properties became places maintained for her rather than lived in by her. Decade by decade, the pattern hardened into something rare even among the wealthy. Many families close a country house for the season. They mothball rooms, turn down heat, and return when society expects it. Huguette's version of closure had no calendar and no audience. The houses remained hers in full, yet she stopped inhabiting them in the way a house ordinarily demands. The doors stayed locked, the curtains stayed drawn or carefully arranged, and the owner's absence became the defining feature of the residence. To the public imagination, wealth can freeze time. A fortune can keep paint fresh, lawns green, and furniture covered in protective cloth, as if the years are merely passing outside the windows. But the reality inside an unoccupied home is less forgiving. The moment a building stops being lived in, it changes. Daily life showers running, ovens heating, footsteps moving air through rooms forms a kind of informal maintenance. Without it, small problems become invisible, and invisibility is what allows them to grow. Operating an empty home is, in practice, running a set of systems that no longer benefit from human habit. HVAC cycles must be managed not for comfort, but for preservation. Temperature and humidity must be kept within ranges that protect woodwork, textiles, and art. Too dry and finishes crack, veneers lift, and joints loosen. Too damp and mold blooms behind draperies, in closets, in the quiet corners where air does not circulate. In coastal California, salt air adds another layer of risk. In New York, winter cold threatens pipes and plaster. Pest control becomes a year-round campaign. A lived-in house has noise and light, disturbances that discourage certain intruders. An empty one offers stillness. Mice find warmth in walls. Insects settle into upholstery and stored fabrics. Termites, in the wrong place at the wrong time, can turn a beam into a hollowed shell. Prevention requires routine inspections, bait stations, sealed entry points, and the kind of patient vigilance that feels almost absurd until the damage is discovered. Water is the great enemy of preservation, and empty houses are especially vulnerable to it. A small leak under a sink might be noticed immediately by someone reaching for a glass. In an unoccupied room, it can seep for days or weeks before it is seen, staining ceilings and swelling floors. So caretakers check shutoff valves, test sump pumps, clear gutters, and walk the property after storms. They look for dampness, for smells, for the slight discoloration that suggests trouble behind the surface. Their work is not glamorous, but it is the difference between a preserved interior and a ruined one. Gardens, too, do not pause because the owner is away. Lawns must be cut, trees must be trimmed away from roofs and wires, irrigation systems must be monitored and repaired. In Santa Barbara, the romantic abundance of greenery is sustained by labor and water, and without constant attention, the garden begins to revert not into wilderness, but into disorder. Hedges lose their crisp lines, flower beds thin, wind breaks branches. The estate starts to look less like a paradise and more like a property awaiting sale, which for an old money family can feel like a kind of humiliation. Security protocols change when a house becomes a museum to itself. A lived-in residence has human unpredictability, lights turning on at odd hours, a car arriving, voices, movement. An empty residence signals its own vulnerability. Guards or caretakers become essential, as do alarms, cameras, and careful routines meant to create the impression of presence. Lights may be timed to turn on and off, vehicles may be moved, curtains adjusted, mail managed. The goal is not only to deter theft, but to discourage curiosity, because curiosity in an empty grand house has a way of turning into intrusion. All of this costs money, but it also costs time and emotional energy. Most of it not from the owner, but from the people hired to keep the illusion intact. Staff and contractors become the living heartbeat of a place whose owner is elsewhere. Housekeepers dust rooms they may never see occupied. Gardeners prune shrubs to frame views for an absent viewer. Maintenance men replace filters, test boilers, and patch stucco with the knowledge that perfection is expected, even if no one is there to appreciate it. Their livelihoods depend on the maintenance of absence. In that fact, there is a strange dignity and a quiet sadness. Work is real regardless of who witnesses it, yet it is difficult not to feel the loneliness implied by a dining room set for no one. A bed turned down in a room that has not held sleep in years. The staff may speak of the owner with loyalty, even affection, but their daily reality is a house that asks to be cared for while withholding the ordinary rewards of being lived in. The houses themselves begin to take on a preserved quality, like stage sets waiting for actors who never arrive. Furniture stays exactly arranged. Rugs remain covered by runners. Some rooms are closed entirely, protected from light and dust as if they were archives. The silence becomes part of the property's identity. In time, an empty house can feel less like a home and more like a decision made permanent. And still, despite every effort, time asserts itself. Buildings settle, materials age, styles shift. What once looked timeless begins to look dated, not because it has deteriorated, but because the world around it has moved on. Even the best preserved property becomes vulnerable to changing tastes and economic pressures. A house that is no longer used must justify itself in a different way, as a legacy, a monument, a repository, a promise. For Huguette, continuing to fund these places without living in them may have felt like stewardship, a refusal to abandon what had been entrusted to her. It may also have been a way to keep control over memory, proof that the past was still intact somewhere, waiting. Yet that control was expensive. The ability to freeze a house in time requires constant motion by others, an entire workforce turning like gears behind closed doors. And while buildings can be maintained in near-perfect condition, people cannot be preserved in quite the same way. Caretakers age. Trusted employees retire. Knowledge of a property's quirks, where the roof tends to leak, which radiator hisses, which lock sticks in fog, walks out the gate in human bodies. As Huguette's absence stretched from months to years, the perimeter of dependence expanded. More managers, more intermediaries, more signatures were needed to keep the silence orderly. By the time the withdrawal was complete, the question was no longer whether the houses were beautiful. They were. The question was what that immaculate beauty meant. A preserved home can look like devotion. It can also look like loneliness made architectural, wealth used to hold rooms in suspension while life happens somewhere else. And as the decades of absence accumulated, the logistical miracle of maintaining emptiness began to point toward the next, more unsettling chapter one, in which the owner's own life would also be managed at a distance, by the same kind of quiet machinery that kept her houses still. It is one of the great modern ironies of American wealth that a person can own oceans of real estate and still spend her days inside a room measured in feet. In Huguette Clark's case, the room was a hospital suite in New York, and what began as a medical necessity hardened over time into a way of life, an arrangement so prolonged that it challenged ordinary language. It was not simply hospitalization. It was residence, with all the paperwork and gatekeeping that residence implies. The timeline, in broad strokes, is deceptively simple. An elderly woman enters the hospital for treatment and observation. The expectation for most patients is discharge, home, rehabilitation, assisted living, some next step that returns life to a private setting. For Huguette, the next step did not arrive in the usual way. Days became months, and then years, and the hospital became the place where decisions were made, documents were signed, and the world was filtered. How does such an arrangement persist? Part of the answer lies in the genuine complexity of age. Frailty is not a single condition. It is an accumulation of risks. A fall can be catastrophic. Infection can arrive quickly. Medication interactions can confuse even careful minds. Hospitals offer supervision, immediate response, and the reassurance of constant monitoring. For families with fewer resources, that reassurance is weighed against cost and availability. For Huguette, cost was not the obstacle. The obstacle was something less tangible, what she trusted, what she feared, and who, in the end, defined safe. Around a wealthy private elder, an ecosystem forms almost automatically. It begins with medicine, physicians, specialists, nurses, aides. Then come the institutional roles, social workers tasked with evaluating discharge plans, capacity, and support systems. Add to that the legal and financial apparatus that follows large estates as faithfully as a shadow. Attorneys, accountants, trustees, and advisors who interpret wishes and ensure compliance. Finally, there are the personal intermediaries, companions, assistants, trusted helpers who manage calls, arrange visits, bring food or small comforts, and crucially, become the everyday human interface between the elder and everyone else. Each role can be legitimate. Each can also become powerful because power in this setting is not primarily about force. It is about access. Access determines who can speak to the patient, who can bring information, who can explain options, and who can frame the outside world as either welcoming or dangerous. In a hospital, access is shaped by policy and by practice. There are visiting hours and privacy rules, but there are also habits, nurses who recognize familiar faces, staff who defer to the people who seem in charge, and administrators who prefer stability to controversy. If the patient is quiet, if she rarely complains, if she seems content, the system is inclined to accept the arrangement as a kind of settled order. Huguette's privacy complicated everything. She had lived for decades with limited public contact, and she did not suddenly become a social creature in her 90s. A person who has always preferred seclusion is easy to interpret as consenting to it. Yet consent in old age is rarely a clean, bright thing. It is shaped by fatigue, by fear, by physical weakness, and by the subtle pressure of being dependent on others for the smallest needs. When mobility is limited, even turning on a bedside lamp can require help. What, then, does autonomy look like? Legally, autonomy is often expressed through documents, powers of attorney, healthcare proxies, wills, trust amendments. These papers can be perfectly proper and still fail to capture the human reality of dependence. A signature can confirm intent, but intent can be influenced by who brings the document, who explains it, and what alternatives are presented. Formality can look like protection while also functioning as a barrier, because once a legal structure is in place, institutions tend to follow it rigidly. The law prefers clear authority, and a vulnerable person's life can be organized around whoever holds it. Conflicts of interest are not always dramatic, and that is what makes them dangerous. A lawyer may genuinely believe he is serving a client while also benefiting from fees and expanded responsibilities. An accountant may protect assets while growing indispensable. A companion may be devoted while also receiving gifts. A hospital may provide excellent care while also billing for prolonged stays. None of these facts on their own prove wrongdoing. Together, they create a situation where incentives quietly align around continuation. For Huguette, whose fortune remained substantial and whose properties continued to be maintained at great expense, money was both shield and magnet. It could pay for privacy, but privacy required gatekeepers, and gatekeepers could become the only interpreters of her wishes. Wealth could fund the best medical attention, but it could also encourage a certain attentiveness from people who understood, perhaps too well, what proximity might mean. The question of who controlled her communications becomes central. In the hospital years, the ordinary channels of life, mail, phone calls, visits could be managed by others. A call can be redirected. A letter can be delayed or explained away. Visitors can be told she is tired, or that she does not wish to see anyone, or that it is not a good day. Sometimes those statements are true. Sometimes they are convenient. From the outside, it can be nearly impossible to tell the difference because the person at the center is physically out of reach. This is where narrative tension builds, not from sensational claims but from human ambiguity. Huguette may have preferred the predictability of the hospital. She may have felt safer there than in an empty mansion. She may have been genuinely fond of certain staff members and grateful for routine. She may also have been vulnerable to influence precisely because she was grateful, because gratitude can create obligation, and obligation can be exploited without anyone raising their voice. Doctors and social workers occupy a particularly delicate place in this ecosystem. Their duty is to the patient, yet they operate within institutions that value clear lines of authority. They assess capacity, but capacity is not binary, it fluctuates. A person can understand some decisions and not others. She can be lucid in the morning and confused at night. She can be competent and still be easily persuaded by the person she trusts most. Evaluating such realities is difficult even in families with open communication. In a life as private as Huguette's, the evaluation becomes even harder. And then there is the emotional element, the one no court filing can fully describe. A hospital room can become its own small kingdom, especially for someone who has long lived in carefully curated spaces. The bed becomes a center. The schedule becomes a boundary. The outside world becomes distant, sometimes frightening in its noise and unpredictability. In that setting, dependence can feel like comfort. It can also feel like surrender, but a surrender so gradual that it never quite announces itself as such. The contrast is brutal. Great wealth is supposed to make a person invulnerable, able to purchase choice, dignity, and control. The aging body, meanwhile, strips life down to essentials: strength, balance, breath, pain, and fatigue. Legal formality promises clarity, yet the human reality remains messy. The richest woman can be, in the simplest sense, captive to her own weakness and to the intentions, good or otherwise, of the people closest to her. By the end of the hospital years, the question is not merely how long she stayed, but what that long stay meant. Was she protected from the risks of the world, held gently in a place of care? Was she influenced, even isolated, because her wealth made her worth managing? Or did protection and influence become entangled until they were indistinguishable? A braid of duty and opportunity tightening over time. Those questions would not remain private forever. The very discretion that had shielded Huguette for decades would eventually crack under scrutiny. And when it did, the world would begin to ask what had been done in that quiet room and what, in the end, consent truly looked like behind a closed hospital door. The Clark story, for decades, had been sustained by quiet rooms, quiet transactions, quiet routines that kept wealth moving without drawing attention. Then, almost inevitably, the quiet broke. What had been managed behind doors and through intermediaries began to unspool in public, not with a single dramatic revelation, but with the slow accumulation of documents, questions, and the uncomfortable clarity that comes when private arrangements meet daylight. Investigative reporting served as the first wide-open window. Journalists began assembling a timeline that had been difficult to see from the outside. An elderly heiress living year after year in a hospital, an unusually tight circle of advisors and aides, and significant financial decisions being made in a setting that seemed, on its face, incompatible with independent living. The reporting did not conjure facts out of gossip. It drew from filings, interviews, and the plain, stubborn evidence of records: who was paid, who had authority, who had access, and how the machinery of an estate operated when the owner was physically frail and socially secluded. Official scrutiny followed the logic of any large contested fortune. Once questions are raised, the system demands answers in forms it recognizes. Attorneys examined powers of attorney, trust instruments, and amendments. Regulators and prosecutors looked for signs of exploitation, undue influence, or violations of fiduciary duty. The court process did what courts always do: turn human relationships into exhibits, reduce years of intimacy and dependence into paragraphs, signatures, and bank statements. Milestones appeared, petitions filed, hearings scheduled, affidavits submitted. There were moments when the legal language felt almost brutally sterile, describing a life in terms of capacity and control. Who could approve expenditures? Who could authorize gifts? Who could determine visitors? Who could direct the management of properties that had become, in effect, financial planets with their own gravitational pull? When privacy is breached by necessity, the breach is not gentle, it is forensic. In this phase, the houses re-enter the narrative not as romantic settings but as assets with consequences. Bellosguardo, with its oceanfront myth and decades of careful upkeep, had to be appraised like any other property, its value measured against its costs and condition. The Fifth Avenue residence, once a symbol of Gilded Age permanence, became another line in an accounting ledger, subject to market comparisons and practical questions: what had been maintained, what had been deferred, what needed repair after long years of limited use. Deferred maintenance is the quiet killer of grand properties. A house can look immaculate in photographs and still hide expensive problems: aging mechanical systems, outdated wiring, hidden moisture damage, roofs that have reached the end of their life, stucco that has been patched too many times. Even when staff do their best, the absence of an owner can delay major decisions. Large projects require authorization, and authorization requires someone willing to accept disruption and expense. In court and in the press, the residences became evidence of stewardship or of its failures. Staff testimony and contractor records, where they appeared, offered a sobering counterpoint to the glamour of old money. They describe routines, access patterns, and the practical reality of who gave instructions. They illuminated the strange life of a house kept perfect for someone who rarely entered it, and they hinted at the broader vulnerability of an estate that depends on a small number of human beings to translate an owner's wishes into daily action. A fortune can be vast, but it is still administered by people, and people bring their own limitations and temptations into the work. Settlements, when they came, carried their own moral ambiguity. A settlement is not a tidy verdict. It is an agreement to stop bleeding in public. It can signal accountability without declaring guilt. It can reimburse an estate while leaving questions unanswered. It can feel like justice to some and compromise to others. Yet, for a fortune as large and complex as Huguette Clark's, settlements also reflect a hard truth. Prolonged litigation consumes money, time, and emotional energy at an astonishing rate. Even billions can be eroded by legal conflict, management fees, and the sheer cost of untangling decisions made over years. This is where the motif of inventory becomes unavoidable. Courts and executors take stock because they must. They list jewelry, paintings, dolls, miniatures, furniture, bank accounts, properties, and receivables. Items are photographed, cataloged, and assigned values. The language becomes clinical: appraised at, estimated at, sold for. An object that once sat quietly in a private room becomes a numbered lot. A house that once embodied a family's identity becomes a parcel with comparable sales. There is something both necessary and tragic about that transformation. Inventory is how an estate is protected, how heirs and charities receive what is intended, how theft is prevented, and taxes are calculated. It is also how a life can be reduced, almost against everyone's will, to the shape of its possessions. In the end, The story of Huguette Clark risks being told not through her voice always faint in the public record, but through the glittering totals attached to her belongings. The valuations themselves can dazzle. A single painting can command more than most people earn in a lifetime. A rare doll collection can be worth millions. An oceanfront estate can be priced like a small kingdom. Yet the glitter of valuation is paired, inevitably, with the smallness of the room where many decisions were made. A hospital suite, a bed, a tray table holding papers, a pen in a hand that may have been tired. The grandeur is immense, the setting is painfully modest, and beneath the valuations lies the cost that cannot be itemized. The emotional toll of suspicion, the moral strain on those who believed they were helping, the fear of those who wondered whether they had failed to protect. The conflict draws in institutions, relatives, employees, professionals, each convinced, perhaps sincerely, that they are acting responsibly. The legal system asks for proof, but human life often provides only impressions, habits, and the delicate question of what someone truly wanted when she was old, private, and dependent. By the time the reckoning reached its public conclusions through settlements, reforms, and the closing of certain legal avenues, the estate had been forced into a new kind of visibility. The Clark world, once defined by discretion, was now mapped in headlines and court records, and the viewer is left with an unsettling dual image: the shimmering inventory of a fortune on one side, and on the other, the intimate reality of an elderly woman whose life, for years, took place within a single room. The next chapter is the one that follows after the filings are closed. What becomes of the houses, the collections, and the idea of stewardship once the person at the center is gone, and once the palaces, at last, must face the future without the quiet will that held them suspended. When Huguette Clark was gone, the spell that had held her houses in suspended animation broke almost at once. In life, her absence had been managed: empty rooms kept ready, gates kept closed, gardens kept trimmed for a return that always remained possible as long as she was alive. After her death, possibility narrowed into paperwork. Estates do not grieve, they transfer. What had been private became, by necessity, procedural, and Bellosguardo, the most mythic of her properties, faced its most radical change yet: the prospect of being opened. The posthumous pivot began with ownership moving into new hands and new missions. Assets were sorted according to legal instruments, settlements, and stated intentions. Some properties could be sold. Some collections could be dispersed. Bellosguardo, however, carried a different kind of weight. It was not merely valuable, it was singular, a coastal estate whose very existence had been shaped by the idea of retreat. Now it was being asked to become, in some form, a public-facing institution, less sanctuary, more stewardship on display. The phrase, turning a private estate public, sounds straightforward until the first practical question is asked: public for whom, and at what cost? A house built for one owner and a carefully managed staff does not automatically translate into a site that can receive visitors, host programs, and survive the constant stress of foot traffic. The romance of heritage is immediate. The reality of preservation is relentless. An endowment, if one exists, is never just a pot of money. It is a promise that must be sized to the property's appetite. Bellosguardo's appetite is enormous. Oceanfront exposure accelerates corrosion and decay. Roof tiles shift in wind. Stucco cracks and must be addressed before water finds its way in. Gardens require irrigation, pruning, replanting, and the careful management of trees that can become hazards in storms. Even a well-maintained estate accumulates backlogs because in private life certain projects can be postponed indefinitely if the owner is not inconvenienced by them. The moment the public is invited, postponement becomes liability. Governance becomes the next challenge, and it is rarely glamorous. A private owner can decide quickly, even whimsically. A public mission requires boards, bylaws, conflict of interest policies, minutes, audits, and the slow consensus building that keeps an institution credible. Who sits on the board? Who has authority to hire and fire? How are contracts awarded? How are donations solicited and reported? The administrative apparatus that once existed to protect privacy is replaced by a different apparatus designed to ensure transparency and compliance. Then there is staffing. A private estate can run with a small, trusted team: caretakers, gardeners, housekeepers, perhaps a manager. A public-facing Bellosguardo needs more layers: docents, visitor services, facilities staff, security, marketing, education coordinators, and professionals who can oversee conservation and collections care. It needs people trained not only to maintain a property but to interpret it, to explain it, to handle the unpredictable realities of public presence. The labor that was once invisible becomes part of the visitor experience, and that visibility changes the atmosphere of the place. Accessibility upgrades bring the first major confrontation between romantic preservation and modern necessity. Historic houses were not built with ramps, elevators, accessible restrooms, or clear emergency egress routes for large groups. Paths may be uneven. Doorways may be narrow. Stairs may be steep. Codes require handrails, exit signage, fire suppression planning, and sometimes seismic or structural upgrades depending on the jurisdiction and use. Each upgrade is a negotiation. Preserve the original fabric or alter it to allow broader access and safer operation. Either choice carries loss. Preserve too rigidly and the public is excluded. Alter too aggressively and the house's historic integrity is compromised. Visitor impact is another unavoidable truth. Opening the gates is often described as democratization, an act of sharing beauty and history with the community. It is also physically wear and tear. Footsteps abrade floors. Sunlight through open curtains fades textiles. Humidity shifts as doors open and close. Restrooms and plumbing systems strain under new demand. Parking and traffic patterns must be addressed. Landscaping must be fortified against crowds who may not understand which areas are fragile. Even the ocean breeze, once a private pleasure, becomes a complicating factor when dozens of people move through rooms that were previously kept stable. Collections, if they remain on site, bring heightened responsibility. Public institutions must account for objects in ways private owners rarely do. Detailed inventories, condition reports, security protocols, insurance coverage, and sometimes climate-controlled display or storage. A single broken item can become a public incident. A single theft can damage a reputation permanently. What once was protected by secrecy now must be protected by systems. And then comes the most delicate challenge of all, interpretation. How does an institution tell the story of a woman defined by privacy? Huguette Clark left behind houses and objects that speak loudly, but she spoke softly and often not at all. A museum-like mission tends to favor narratives, room-by-room explanations, timelines, themes, clear moral lessons. Huguette resists that kind of packaging. Her life was not built around public milestones, it was built around chosen smallness. To interpret her honestly requires restraint, acknowledging her preferences without turning them into caricature, acknowledging the controversies without making them the only story. Donor intent, in such situations, becomes both compass and constraint. Intent can be noble and specific. Preserve the property, support the arts, keep the estate intact. But intent is often expressed without full appreciation of operational realities. A donor may envision a house preserved as is, yet as is may mean systems that are unsafe or unsustainable. A donor may hope for limited access, yet limited access can limit revenue and community support. The institution must decide what can be preserved exactly, what must be adapted, and what compromises are acceptable. In every choice, something is lost: authenticity, privacy, financial stability, or the ability to serve the public. Bellosguardo's second life, then, is not a simple victory of preservation over decay. It is a continuous struggle to balance romance with code compliance, beauty with budgets, and historical integrity with the practical need to keep doors open. Opening the gates is, in one sense, an act of generosity, turning a private kingdom into a shared cultural resource. In another sense, it is an admission that private preservation has limits. A single person can hold an estate in suspension for a lifetime. To hold it for generations requires institutions, funding, and the public's willingness to care. In the end, Bellosguardo becomes a test of what stewardship means when the steward is gone. The estate can be saved, but not in the same way it was kept. The quiet will be replaced by footsteps, the sealed rooms by guided tours, the private horizon by a view shared with strangers. And perhaps that is the final unresolved irony of Huguette Clark's legacy, that a life spent perfecting privacy may be remembered most enduringly through a place that survives only by letting the world in. In the end, Huguette Clark leaves behind no single, satisfying moral, only a set of rooms, a set of records, and a lingering unease that beauty can coexist with confinement. Her life was shaped by an inheritance so large it could purchase quiet itself. And yet that quiet became both refuge and risk. The great paradox is not that she owned so much, but that her world, by choice and by circumstance, grew so small. The Clark houses were built for permanence. They were conceived in an age when architecture served as social proof, when a facade on Fifth Avenue could argue a man into respectability, and when an oceanfront estate could stage a private kingdom at the edge of the continent. Those buildings did what they were meant to do. They lasted, they impressed, they held value. But they also revealed a harsher truth over time. A great house does not simply sit. It asks. It demands. It gathers staff, invoices, schedules, and risk around itself like weather. The more silent it becomes, the more work it requires to keep the silence pristine. Huguette's story makes stewardship feel less like a noble abstraction and more like a daily human task. Stewardship is not only the ability to pay the bills, it is the willingness to make plans, to name responsible overseers, to invite scrutiny before crisis forces it. It is accepting that isolation can be as consequential as extravagance, and that privacy, while precious, can also become a wall behind which influence grows unchecked. For years, her wealth promised invulnerability. It could fund the finest care, secure the finest properties, preserve collections in perfect order. And yet the most vulnerable thing in the story is painfully ordinary. An aging body, a limited circle of trust, a dependence on others for access to the outside world. Legal forms and financial statements offered structure, but they could not guarantee that the human experience inside that structure was free or even fully chosen. The houses, too, become a kind of witness. Bellosguardo, with sun warming its stucco and salt air polishing its edges, still looks like paradise from a distance. It is easy to stand at the gate and imagine only serenity gardens, terraces, the Pacific repeating itself into the horizon. But paradise is never self-sustaining. It survives through labor, governance, and the hard decisions that prevent a beautiful place from becoming an expensive ruin. Back in Manhattan, Fifth Avenue continues its glittering traffic, its revolving fashions, its relentless reinvention. A quiet facade can conceal an entire life's worth of decisions. What was kept, what was avoided, what was postponed. Rooms preserved for someone who rarely entered them become, in retrospect, both tender and disturbing beauty held in suspension. Time purchased, but never truly possessed. So what is the legacy? It is preservation, yes, houses saved, objects cataloged, a coastline still breathing. It is also warning. Having everything can still produce a life constrained by habit, by fear, by dependence, by the sheer machinery required to protect a fortune. Great houses demand more than money. They demand presence. They demand accountability. They demand a plan for what happens when the owner can no longer walk through the door. Huguette Clark remains, finally, an invisible heiress in a visible world. Her story asks what wealth is for if it cannot secure a person's agency, and what a house is for if it becomes only a container for absence. The last light falls on Bellosguardo's lawns, on a quiet Fifth Avenue address, on rooms that waited faithfully. The beauty endures. The question does too.